What if I told you that the biggest lie you've been told about emotions is that you need to express them to be healthy? Most people think emotional authenticity means letting their feelings run wild, reacting to every trigger, and wearing their heart on their sleeve. But here's the brutal truth that will change everything you believe about emotional intelligence. The strongest, most successful people in the world have mastered something that most people never even attempt. They've trained their minds to be stronger than their emotions, not suppressed, not ignored, stronger. There's a massive difference between emotional suppression and emotional mastery. And understanding this difference will determine whether you spend your life as a victim of your feelings or as the architect of your own emotional reality. Every single day, you make hundreds of decisions based on how you feel rather than what you know is right. You avoid difficult conversations because you feel uncomfortable. You procrastinate on important tasks because you don't feel motivated. You react defensively when someone challenges you because you feel threatened. You make impulsive purchases because you feel stressed or bored. You stay in toxic relationships because you feel afraid of being alone. You accept mediocrity in your career because you feel unworthy of more. Your emotions are making decisions for you, and those decisions are keeping you trapped in patterns that destroy your potential. The human brain evolved to prioritize emotional reactions over logical reasoning because, for thousands of years, quick emotional responses kept our ancestors alive. Fear made them run from predators. Anger gave them strength to fight threats. Joy bonded them to their tribe. But in modern society, these same emotional patterns that once ensured survival are now sabotaging your success, your relationships, and your peace of mind. You're living with Stone Age emotional programming in a modern world that demands sophisticated emotional intelligence. The pharmaceutical industry has convinced millions of people that emotional distress is a chemical imbalance that requires medication. The therapy industry has convinced people that emotional healing requires years of talking about feelings and childhood trauma. The self-help industry has convinced people that positive thinking and affirmations can overcome deep emotional patterns. All of these approaches miss the fundamental truth about emotional mastery. Emotions are not mysterious forces beyond your control. They are trainable responses that follow predictable patterns. Just like you can train your body to be stronger, faster, and more resilient, you can train your mind to be stronger than any emotional state. The process requires understanding the neurological basis of emotional reactions, implementing systematic conditioning protocols, and practicing specific techniques until emotional regulation becomes your default operating system. Most people spend their entire lives reacting to their emotions rather than directing them. They think thoughts like, "I can't help how I feel," or "My emotions are just too strong," or "I'm naturally an emotional person." These are learned helplessness statements that keep you trapped in emotional immaturity. The truth is that emotional mastery is a skill, and like any skill, it can be developed through proper training, consistent practice, and systematic progression. Your emotions are not random events that happen to you. They are sophisticated biological programs designed to influence your behavior, and once you understand how these programs work, you can reprogram them completely. Most people have no idea that their emotional responses are following predictable patterns established in childhood and reinforced through repetition over decades. Every time you react emotionally to a trigger, you're strengthening neural pathways that make that same reaction more likely in the future. This creates what psychologists call emotional conditioning, where certain situations automatically trigger certain feelings, and those feelings automatically trigger certain behaviors. You've been unknowingly training your brain to be emotionally reactive through years of unconscious practice. The good news is that neuroplasticity research shows you can rewire these patterns at any age through deliberate mental training. The process begins with understanding the three-step emotional reaction sequence that controls most people's behavior. First, there's the trigger, which is any external event or internal thought that initiates an emotional response. Second, there's the feeling, which is the physiological sensation created by hormonal and neurochemical changes in your body. Third, there's the reaction, which is the behavior you choose based on that feeling. Most people have no conscious awareness of this sequence because it happens so quickly and automatically. They experience trigger feeling reaction as a single, unavoidable event. Someone criticizes them, they feel hurt, they react defensively. These three steps seem to happen simultaneously, creating the illusion that emotional reactions are involuntary. But between each step, there's a gap where choice exists. Neural scientists have measured this gap. It lasts approximately 90 seconds. That's how long it takes for the chemical reaction of any emotion to completely flood your system and then flush out. 90 seconds. If you're still angry, hurt, or anxious after 90 seconds, it's because you're choosing to restart the emotional reaction cycle through your thoughts and focus. You're re-triggering yourself by replaying the situation, imagining future confrontations, or ruminating on past hurts. The reason most people never gain emotional control is that they focus on managing their feelings instead of managing their thoughts. They try to calm down after they're already upset, instead of training their minds to interpret situations differently in the first place. This backwards approach keeps them trapped in endless cycles of emotional reactivity because they're trying to solve the problem at the wrong level. Emotional mastery happens at the interpretation level, not the feeling level. When you change how you interpret events, you change which emotions get triggered. When you change which emotions get triggered, you change how you feel. When you change how you feel, you change how you behave. Most people interpret neutral events as personal attacks. They interpret challenges as threats. They interpret setbacks as evidence of their inadequacy. They interpret other people's behavior as commentary on their worth. These interpretations create emotional chaos because they're based on assumptions, projections, and insecurities rather than objective reality. Here's what most people don't understand about emotional strength. It's not about becoming cold, detached, or unfeeling. It's about developing such powerful mental discipline that you can experience any emotion without being controlled by it. You feel fear and move forward anyway. You feel anger and respond strategically anyway. You feel sadness and maintain your functionality anyway. You feel excitement and keep your judgment clear anyway. This is the difference between emotional suppression and emotional transcendence. Suppression means pushing feelings down and pretending they don't exist, which creates internal pressure that eventually explodes in destructive ways. Transcendence means acknowledging emotions fully while maintaining complete behavioral choice regardless of what you're feeling. The cost of emotional weakness extends far beyond personal discomfort. It affects every area of your life in ways you might not even realize. Emotionally reactive people make terrible decisions because their judgment becomes clouded by whatever they're feeling in the moment. They choose careers based on passion instead of market reality and end up struggling financially. They make relationship decisions based on infatuation or loneliness instead of compatibility and end up in toxic dynamics. They make business decisions based on fear or greed instead of strategic analysis and end up facing preventable failures. Emotional reactivity also destroys your credibility and social influence. When people see that your mood and behavior change based on circumstances, they lose trust in your stability and leadership capacity. They start managing their communication with you to avoid triggering your emotional responses. They stop bringing you important information because they're afraid of your reaction. They begin to see you as someone who needs to be handled rather than someone who can handle responsibility. This creates a downward spiral where your emotional instability leads to decreased respect, which triggers more emotional reactions, which leads to even less respect. The professional cost is especially severe. Employers promote people they can count on to remain stable under pressure. They give leadership opportunities to individuals who can make rational decisions regardless of stress levels. They assign important projects to team members who won't have emotional breakdowns when things get difficult. If you're known as someone who gets overwhelmed, defensive, or dramatic when faced with challenges, you'll be passed over for advancement opportunities regardless of your technical skills. The relationship cost is equally devastating. Emotionally reactive people drain the energy from their relationships because others constantly have to manage their feelings. Friends become exhausted by the drama and start limiting their involvement in your life. Romantic partners begin walking on eggshells to avoid triggering your emotional responses. Family members learn to withhold information or opinions because they don't want to deal with your reactions. The systematic approach to training your mind begins with understanding that emotions are information, not instructions. They provide data about your current state and circumstances, but they should never be the primary factor in your decision-making process. Professional athletes understand this principle perfectly. They feel fear before attempting dangerous maneuvers, but they don't let that fear determine whether they compete. They feel frustration when they make mistakes, but they don't let that frustration destroy their focus for the rest of the performance. They feel excitement when they're winning, but they don't let that excitement make them overconfident and careless. This is emotional discipline in action. The first component of systematic emotional training is developing emotional awareness without emotional attachment. Most people experience emotions so intensely that they become completely identified with whatever they're feeling. When they're angry, they don't think "I'm experiencing anger." They think "I am angry," as if anger is their entire identity in that moment. This identification makes it impossible to gain perspective or choose alternative responses. Advanced emotional training teaches you to observe your emotions as temporary mental events rather than absolute truths about reality. You learn to notice anger without becoming angry, fear without becoming fearful, sadness without becoming sad. This observer perspective creates the mental space necessary for conscious choice. The second component is cognitive reframing, which means systematically challenging and changing the thought patterns that create emotional reactions. Most emotional disturbance comes from irrational beliefs about how life should work. People get upset because they believe things shouldn't be difficult, people should treat them fairly, their efforts should guarantee success, and bad things shouldn't happen to good people. These beliefs set up constant conflict between expectation and reality that generates endless emotional turmoil. Cognitive reframing teaches you to replace these irrational expectations with realistic assessments of how the world actually operates. The third component is exposure training, which involves deliberately exposing yourself to situations that trigger emotional responses so you can practice maintaining composure under increasingly challenging conditions. Just like physical fitness requires progressive resistance training, emotional fitness requires progressive exposure to emotional challenges. You start with minor discomforts and gradually work up to more intense triggers, building your emotional resilience systematically over time. This approach transforms emotional regulation from an abstract concept into a practical skill set that improves through consistent practice. The fourth component is physiological regulation, which means learning to control the physical aspects of emotional responses through breathing techniques, posture management, and movement patterns. Since emotions are partly physical phenomena, you can influence them directly through physical interventions that activate your nervous system's calming mechanisms. The transformation process begins the moment you stop asking, "How do I stop feeling this way?" and start asking, "How do I respond powerfully regardless of how I feel?" This shift in focus changes everything because it moves you from victimhood to mastery. Instead of trying to eliminate challenging emotions, you learn to use them as fuel for more effective action. Fear becomes a signal to prepare more thoroughly. Anger becomes energy for addressing problems more decisively. Sadness becomes an opportunity for deeper reflection and connection. Frustration becomes motivation for finding better strategies. Every emotion becomes a resource rather than a limitation. The identity shift required for emotional mastery means seeing yourself as someone who has complete choice over their responses, regardless of circumstances. This isn't positive thinking or self-deception. It's a fundamental change in how you relate to your own mind. Instead of being at the mercy of whatever thoughts and feelings arise, you become the director of your internal experience. You learn to choose your thoughts deliberately, which influences your emotions predictably, which shapes your behavior intentionally. This creates an upward spiral where better emotional regulation leads to better decisions, which lead to better results, which reinforces your identity as someone who has control over their emotional state. The practical implementation begins with daily emotional training exercises that gradually increase your capacity for emotional regulation. These aren't meditation techniques or relaxation strategies. They're systematic conditioning protocols designed to strengthen specific mental skills through repetition and progressive challenge. You'll practice maintaining composure during artificially created stress situations. You'll train your ability to reframe negative interpretations into constructive perspectives. You'll develop automatic emotional regulation responses that activate without conscious effort. The goal is to make emotional strength so natural and automatic that it becomes your default operating system rather than something you have to work to maintain. The people who master this training report a profound sense of personal freedom that comes from knowing they can handle any emotional challenge that arises. They describe feeling unshakable regardless of external circumstances because their emotional stability comes from internal discipline rather than favorable conditions. They make decisions based on their values and strategic thinking rather than their momentary feelings. They build relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional dependency. They pursue goals with consistent effort rather than motivation-dependent bursts of activity followed by periods of discouragement and inaction. This level of emotional mastery transforms every aspect of your life because it eliminates the internal chaos that prevents most people from reaching their potential. Most people believe that strong emotions are evidence of passion and authenticity, but here's what they don't realize. Emotional intensity is actually a sign of poor mental conditioning, not depth of character. When you see someone having dramatic emotional outbursts, you're not witnessing someone who feels things more deeply than others. You're witnessing someone whose emotional regulation system is so underdeveloped that minor triggers create major disruptions in their internal state. This is like watching someone who gets completely exhausted walking up a single flight of stairs and thinking they're more physically engaged with the world than a trained athlete. The athlete experiences physical sensations just as intensely, but their conditioning allows them to maintain performance regardless of discomfort. Emotional mastery works the same way. The goal isn't to feel less, it's to function better regardless of what you're feeling. Advanced practitioners of emotional training develop what psychologists call emotional granularity, which is the ability to identify and differentiate between subtle variations in emotional states. While most people experience emotions in broad categories like good or bad, happy or sad, strong or weak, emotionally trained individuals can distinguish between dozens of different emotional states and understand exactly what each one is telling them about their current situation. This precision allows them to respond appropriately rather than reactively. For example, they can tell the difference between anxiety that signals the need for more preparation and anxiety that signals they're overthinking a situation. They can distinguish between anger that indicates a legitimate boundary violation and anger that reflects their own unrealistic expectations. They can separate sadness that calls for reflection and processing from sadness that indicates they're focusing on things they can't control. This level of emotional sophistication transforms emotions from disruptive forces into sophisticated feedback systems. The training process for developing emotional granularity begins with systematic emotion logging, where you track not just what emotions you experience, but the specific triggers that created them, the thoughts that accompanied them, the physical sensations involved, and the behavioral choices you made in response. This data collection phase reveals patterns you never noticed before and shows you exactly which situations consistently trigger which emotional responses. Most people discover that their emotional reactions are far more predictable and manageable than they realized once they start paying systematic attention to the underlying patterns. The next phase involves emotional stress testing, where you deliberately expose yourself to controlled versions of your emotional triggers while practicing specific regulation techniques. This isn't about overwhelming yourself or creating trauma. It's about gradually building your capacity to maintain composure under increasingly challenging conditions. You start with situations that create mild emotional discomfort and practice your regulation techniques until maintaining control becomes automatic. Then you progressively increase the intensity of the challenges while maintaining the same level of internal stability. You know that feeling when someone pushes your buttons and you react before you can stop yourself? That automatic reaction is your emotional nervous system operating on outdated programming that was installed years ago without your conscious permission. Every time someone treated you unfairly as a child and you couldn't respond, Your nervous system created a compensation pattern. Every time you were criticized and felt powerless to defend yourself, your brain developed protective reactions. Every time you experienced rejection or abandonment, your emotional system built walls and triggers designed to prevent future pain. These protective mechanisms made sense when you were young and truly powerless, but they're now sabotaging your adult relationships and professional success because they respond to current situations based on past wounds rather than present reality. The reprogramming process requires understanding that your current emotional reactions are often completely inappropriate responses to current situations. When your boss gives you critical feedback and you feel that familiar surge of defensive anger, you're not responding to your boss. You're responding to every authority figure who ever made you feel small and powerless. When someone disagrees with your opinion and you feel personally attacked, you're not responding to their disagreement. You're responding to childhood experiences where being wrong meant being rejected or punished. When you avoid taking risks because you're afraid of failure, you're not making a rational assessment of current opportunities. You're responding to past situations where failure led to shame or disappointment. This recognition is simultaneously liberating and disturbing because it means most of your emotional reactions have nothing to do with what's actually happening in the present moment. The systematic approach to emotional reprogramming involves identifying your specific emotional triggers, tracing them back to their original installation, and then deliberately creating new response patterns through repetition and practice. The first step is trigger mapping, where you identify the specific situations, words, behaviors, or circumstances that consistently create emotional reactions. Most people have between 5 and 10 primary triggers that account for 90% of their emotional disturbance. Common triggers include being ignored, being criticized, being controlled, being rejected, being misunderstood, being treated unfairly, being interrupted, being questioned, being compared to others, or being made to wait. Once you've identified your triggers, you trace each one back to its probable origin by asking when you first remember feeling that particular emotional reaction and what circumstances surrounded that original experience. This isn't therapy or emotional processing. It's data collection designed to help you understand why your nervous system learned to react in specific ways. The final step is response replacement, where you consciously choose new behavioral responses to your triggers and practice them repeatedly until they become automatic. Instead of getting defensive when criticized, you practice saying, "Thank you for the feedback. Let me think about that." Instead of getting angry when controlled, you practice calmly stating your boundaries. Instead of getting hurt when rejected, you practice maintaining your sense of self-worth regardless of other people's decisions. Here's the truth about emotional conditioning that most people never discover. Your nervous system cannot distinguish between imagined experiences and real experiences when it comes to emotional learning. This means you can accelerate your emotional training by using visualization and mental rehearsal to practice new response patterns without waiting for triggering situations to occur naturally. Professional athletes use this principle when they mentally rehearse perfect performances before competitions. Their nervous systems respond to the imagined experience as if it were real, creating muscle memory and confidence that transfers to actual performance. You can use the same principle to create emotional muscle memory by mentally rehearsing calm, composed responses to your typical triggers. The key is making your visualizations as detailed and realistic as possible, including the specific words people might say, the physical sensations you might feel, and the exact responses you want to have. The more vivid and specific your mental rehearsals, the more effectively they reprogram your automatic response patterns. Advanced practitioners spend 15 to 20 minutes daily rehearsing perfect emotional responses to challenging situations. They visualize themselves remaining calm when criticized, confident when challenged, and composed when rejected. They practice these scenarios repeatedly until maintaining emotional control feels natural and automatic. This mental conditioning creates what sports psychologists call overlearning, where the new response pattern becomes so deeply ingrained that it activates without conscious effort. The transformation happens gradually over weeks and months as the new patterns become stronger than the old ones. Most people notice significant changes in their emotional reactivity within 30 to 60 days of consistent mental rehearsal practice. The process requires understanding that emotional strength is not about eliminating feelings or becoming emotionless. It's about developing such reliable access to your composed, confident state that you can maintain that state regardless of external circumstances or internal sensations. You still feel everything, but you respond from a place of choice rather than compulsion. You experience emotions as temporary weather patterns moving through your awareness rather than fundamental truths about your identity or situation. This creates psychological resilience that allows you to handle any situation with grace and effectiveness. The people who master this level of emotional conditioning describe it as feeling like they have an internal refuge that they can access anytime they need it. No matter how chaotic the external situation becomes, they know they can return to their center and respond from a place of clarity and strength. This internal stability becomes the foundation for everything else in their lives, because it eliminates the emotional volatility that destroys relationships, sabotages careers, and prevents consistent progress toward important goals. What if I told you that the reason you can't control your emotions is because you're trying to control them at the wrong level? Most people attempt emotional regulation through willpower, positive thinking, or suppression techniques. But these approaches fail because they're working against your nervous system instead of with it. Your emotional responses are controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which operates below the level of conscious thought and responds to physiological signals faster than your rational mind can process information. This is why you can intellectually know that someone's criticism isn't a personal attack while simultaneously feeling hurt and defensive. Your rational mind understands the logic, but your nervous system is responding to physiological cues that trigger ancient survival programs. The solution isn't to override your nervous system through mental force. The solution is to learn how to communicate with your nervous system in its own language, which is physical sensation and breathing patterns. When you change your physiology, you change your emotional state automatically, because emotions are largely physiological phenomena. Fear creates shallow breathing, increased heart rate, and muscle tension. Anger creates heated skin, clenched jaw, and aggressive posture. Sadness creates heavy breathing, slumped shoulders, and low energy. These physical patterns aren't just symptoms of emotions, they're actually creating and maintaining the emotional states. When you consciously change the physical pattern, you interrupt the emotional state. This is why breathing techniques are so effective for emotional regulation. When you deliberately slow your breathing, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which automatically creates feelings of calm and control. When you consciously relax facial tension, you interrupt anxiety and anger patterns. When you deliberately straighten your posture, you increase confidence and alertness. The key is understanding that these physical interventions work faster and more reliably than mental techniques because they're working at the same level where emotions are actually generated. Advanced emotional training involves developing a toolkit of specific physiological interventions that you can use to access desired emotional states on command. Professional performers use these techniques to manage stage fright, athletes use them to maintain composure under pressure, and business leaders use them to stay calm during high-stakes negotiations. The basic protocol involves identifying the physical signature of your optimal emotional state and then learning to recreate that physical signature deliberately whenever you need to access that state. Your optimal state is the combination of physical sensations, breathing patterns, and mental focus that represents you at your most composed, confident, and effective. For most people, this includes deep, slow breathing, relaxed facial muscles, straight but comfortable posture, soft but focused gaze, and a sense of grounded stability in their lower body. Once you've identified your optimal physical state, you practice recreating it during neutral situations until you can access it quickly and reliably. The ultimate goal of emotional training isn't emotional control, it's emotional freedom. This means developing such mastery over your internal state that you're never held hostage by your feelings, but you're also never cut off from the valuable information that emotions provide. You become someone who can feel deeply without losing their center, respond passionately without becoming reactive, and maintain their composure without becoming cold or disconnected. This level of mastery creates what psychologists call emotional agility, which is the ability to navigate complex emotional situations with flexibility and skill. Emotionally agile people can shift fluidly between different emotional states based on what the situation requires. They can be appropriately serious in professional settings and genuinely playful in social settings. They can express legitimate anger when boundaries are violated and genuine warmth when connection is called for. They can feel and express grief when loss occurs and authentic joy when celebration is appropriate. The key difference is that all of these emotional expressions are conscious choices rather than automatic reactions. They're using emotions as tools for effective communication and appropriate response, rather than being controlled by emotions as involuntary forces. This creates authentic emotional expression that serves their goals and relationships rather than sabotaging them. The development process requires practicing emotional range expansion, where you consciously explore and develop your capacity for appropriate emotional expression in different contexts. Many people have limited emotional range because they've learned to suppress certain feelings or because they've become stuck in habitual emotional patterns. Emotional range expansion involves systematically practicing different emotional expressions in safe environments until you can access them authentically when needed. This might mean practicing expressing appropriate anger if you tend to be overly accommodating, or practicing expressing vulnerability if you tend to be overly defensive. The goal isn't to become emotionally unpredictable or manipulative. The goal is to develop such emotional flexibility that you can respond to any situation with the most appropriate and effective emotional expression. The transformation that occurs through this training affects every aspect of your life because emotional mastery is the foundation of all other forms of personal development. When you're no longer at the mercy of your emotional reactions, you can pursue your goals with consistency, build relationships based on genuine connection rather than emotional dependency, make decisions based on wisdom rather than impulse, and maintain your sense of self regardless of external circumstances. This creates a life characterized by internal stability, authentic expression, and conscious choice rather than emotional chaos, reactive patterns, and unconscious behavior. The people who achieve this level of emotional mastery describe it as the most important skill they've ever developed because it enables everything else they want to accomplish in their lives. Most people think that confidence comes from positive experiences and success, but here's what they don't understand. True confidence comes from knowing you can handle any situation regardless of the outcome. The confidence that depends on external validation or favorable circumstances is actually pseudo-confidence that collapses the moment things don't go as planned. Real confidence is built through deliberately exposing yourself to situations where you might fail, be rejected, or face disapproval, and discovering that you can maintain your sense of self-worth regardless of what happens. This process is called confidence inoculation, and it's how military personnel, emergency responders, and elite performers develop unshakable composure under extreme pressure. They don't avoid stressful situations hoping to feel more confident later. They systematically expose themselves to controlled stress so that real-world challenges feel manageable by comparison. The same principle applies to emotional confidence. You don't build emotional strength by avoiding emotional challenges. You build it by facing increasingly difficult emotional situations while maintaining your composure and discovering that you're more resilient than you realized. The confidence inoculation process begins with identifying your confidence weak points, which are the specific situations where you typically lose your composure or feel overwhelmed. Common weak points include public speaking, confrontation, rejection, criticism, uncertainty, high-stakes decisions, social situations with strangers, performance evaluations, difficult conversations, and situations where you're being judged or tested. Once you've identified your weak points, you create a graduated exposure plan where you deliberately seek out mild versions of these situations and practice maintaining your optimal state while navigating them. The key is starting with challenges that are uncomfortable but manageable and gradually increasing the difficulty as your confidence grows. For example, if public speaking is a weak point, you might start by speaking up more in small meetings, then volunteer to give a brief presentation to your team, then seek opportunities to speak to larger groups. Each successful experience builds evidence that you can handle these situations, which increases your confidence for more challenging scenarios. The most important part of confidence inoculation is maintaining your optimal physical and mental state during the exposure exercises. You're not just trying to survive uncomfortable situations, you're trying to thrive in them while feeling calm, centered, and in control. This requires using your breathing techniques, posture management, and cognitive reframing skills to stay composed while facing your confidence challenges. The goal is to prove to yourself that you can maintain your best state even when dealing with your worst fears. You know that voice in your head that questions every decision you make and tells you all the ways things could go wrong. That voice isn't protecting you from danger. It's keeping you trapped in mediocrity by making you second-guess your instincts and overanalyze every situation until you become paralyzed by indecision. This internal critic developed as a protective mechanism when you were young and genuinely needed to be careful about making mistakes. But it's now preventing you from taking the calculated risks necessary for growth and success. The voice of self-doubt has three primary functions that made sense in childhood but are now sabotaging your adult life. First, it tries to prevent mistakes by making you overthink every decision. Second, it tries to prevent rejection by making you avoid situations where you might be judged. Third, it tries to prevent disappointment by lowering your expectations and discouraging you from wanting things that might not work out. While these functions served a purpose when you were dependent on others for survival and had limited ability to recover from setbacks, they're now keeping you playing small and avoiding the challenges that would help you grow. The systematic approach to silencing self-doubt begins with understanding that doubt is not rational analysis. Rational analysis involves gathering relevant information, weighing probable outcomes, and making decisions based on available data. Doubt is emotional reaction disguised as logical thinking. It's your nervous system's attempt to avoid discomfort by convincing you that uncertainty is dangerous. True rational analysis often leads to action despite uncertainty, because most opportunities require moving forward without complete information. Doubt leads to endless analysis that never resolves because it's not actually seeking solutions. It's seeking certainty that doesn't exist. The difference between rational caution and destructive doubt is that rational caution focuses on specific, actionable concerns, while doubt focuses on vague fears and worst-case scenarios. Rational caution asks, what specific risks need to be managed, and how can I prepare for them? Doubt asks, what if everything goes wrong? Rational caution leads to better preparation and calculated risk-taking. Doubt leads to procrastination and missed opportunities. The reprogramming process involves replacing doubt-based thinking with decision-based thinking. Instead of asking, what if this doesn't work? You train yourself to ask, what would I need to believe about myself and this situation to move forward confidently? Instead of focusing on all the ways things could go wrong, you focus on what you can control and how you can prepare for different outcomes. This shift moves you from passive worry to active problem solving. The most effective technique for eliminating self-doubt is called assumption reversal. Instead of assuming that uncertain outcomes will be negative, you train yourself to assume they'll be positive or at least manageable. This isn't positive thinking or self-deception. It's recognizing that most outcomes fall somewhere in the middle, range between best and worst-case scenarios, and that you're probably capable of handling whatever happens better than your doubt voice suggests. Here's what most people don't realize about mental toughness. It's not about being hard or emotionless. It's about being flexible and resilient, like a martial arts master who can absorb tremendous impact without breaking because they know how to bend without losing their center. Mental toughness is the ability to maintain your effectiveness and composure regardless of external pressure, internal discomfort, or uncertain outcomes. This quality separates peak performers from everyone else because it allows them to function at their best when conditions are at their worst. Most people's performance deteriorates under pressure because they fight against discomfort instead of learning to function within it. They waste energy trying to eliminate stress, uncertainty, and challenge instead of developing the skills to excel despite these conditions. Mental toughness training teaches you to reframe pressure as energy, uncertainty as opportunity, and challenge as growth catalyst. The development process begins with pressure desensitization, where you systematically expose yourself to increasing levels of pressure while maintaining your performance standards. This isn't about overwhelming yourself or creating unnecessary stress. It's about gradually expanding your comfort zone by practicing your skills under progressively more challenging conditions. Professional athletes use this principle when they practice with crowd noise, time pressure, and simulated competition conditions. Musicians practice performing in front of audiences before important concerts. Surgeons practice complex procedures under time constraints before performing them on actual patients. The same principle applies to mental and emotional challenges. You can build your capacity to handle criticism by seeking feedback in low-stakes situations. You can build your ability to handle uncertainty by making decisions with incomplete information in areas where the consequences are manageable. You can build your tolerance for conflict by engaging in constructive disagreements about topics that aren't emotionally charged for you. Each successful experience under mild pressure builds your confidence and competence for handling more intense pressure situations. The key is maintaining your standards during pressure training. You're not just trying to survive stressful situations, you're trying to perform at your best despite the stress. This requires practicing your optimal state maintenance techniques while facing real challenges, rather than just in comfortable practice conditions. Mental toughness also involves developing what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to shift your thinking strategies based on what the situation requires. Rigid thinking patterns that work well in comfortable conditions often fail under pressure because pressure situations demand creative problem-solving and adaptive responses. Cognitive flexibility training involves practicing different approaches to common challenges and developing multiple backup plans for important situations. This prevents you from becoming stuck when your preferred approach doesn't work and gives you confidence that you can handle unexpected developments. The reason most people never develop true emotional mastery is because they're trying to solve an advanced problem with beginner-level tools. They're using positive thinking techniques to handle deep conditioning patterns, meditation apps to address trauma responses, and willpower to override nervous system programming. This is like trying to perform surgery with kitchen utensils. The tools aren't designed for the complexity of the problem, so the results are predictably ineffective. Advanced emotional training requires understanding that your emotional responses operate on multiple levels simultaneously, and lasting change requires intervention at each level. The surface level is your conscious thoughts and beliefs about situations. The middle level is your unconscious emotional associations and meaning-making patterns. The deep level is your nervous system's automatic threat detection and response programming. Most self-help approaches only address the surface level through cognitive techniques like positive thinking and rational analysis. While these techniques can provide temporary relief, they don't change the underlying patterns that generate emotional reactions. It's like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house with structural problems. The surface looks better temporarily, but the foundation issues remain unchanged. Comprehensive emotional training addresses all three levels through integrated interventions that create lasting transformation. Surface-level work involves developing conscious awareness of your thought patterns and learning to choose more empowering interpretations of events. Middle-level work involves identifying and updating the unconscious beliefs and associations that trigger emotional reactions. Deep-level work involves retraining your nervous system's automatic responses through exposure, conditioning, and physiological regulation techniques. The integration of these three levels creates what psychologists call coherent change, where your thoughts, feelings, and nervous system responses are all aligned with your conscious intentions. This eliminates the internal conflict that occurs when you intellectually know how you want to respond, but emotionally react in old patterns. The training process requires commitment to working at all three levels consistently over time, rather than looking for quick fixes or magic solutions. Most people see significant changes within the first month of comprehensive training, with major transformations occurring over 3 to 6 months of consistent practice. The key is understanding that emotional mastery is a skill that improves with deliberate practice rather than a state you achieve once and maintain effortlessly. Like physical fitness, it requires ongoing maintenance and progressive challenge to continue developing. The people who achieve lasting emotional transformation are those who approach it as a systematic training program rather than a temporary intervention or quick fix. What if I told you that your biggest emotional triggers aren't random reactions, but sophisticated control systems that other people can activate whenever they want to manipulate your behavior? Every time you have a predictable emotional response to a specific situation or type of person, you're broadcasting a vulnerability that skilled manipulators can exploit to influence your decisions and actions. This is why emotional mastery isn't just about feeling better. It's about maintaining your autonomy and decision-making independence in a world full of people who profit from your emotional reactivity. Consider how advertising exploits emotional triggers to drive purchasing decisions. Fear-based marketing makes you buy insurance and security systems. Greed-based marketing makes you invest in get-rich-quick schemes. Status-based marketing makes you buy luxury items you can't afford. Social proof marketing makes you follow trends and adopt popular opinions. Each of these approaches works by triggering specific emotional states that override rational decision-making and create compulsive behavior. The same dynamic occurs in personal relationships, professional settings, and social situations. People learn which words, behaviors, and situations trigger your emotions, and they use that knowledge to control outcomes in their favor. When you become predictably angry at criticism, people use criticism to shut down your input in meetings. When you become predictably guilty about saying no, people use guilt trips to get you to agree to requests you should decline. When you become predictably anxious about conflict, people use the threat of disagreement to prevent you from advocating for yourself. Your emotional triggers become their control buttons. The liberation process begins with trigger audit, where you identify all the ways your emotional reactions can be used to influence your behavior. Most people discover they have far more exploitable triggers than they realized once they start paying systematic attention to this dynamic. Common manipulation triggers include fear of rejection, need for approval, guilt about disappointing others, anxiety about conflict, anger at perceived disrespect, and insecurity about competence or attractiveness. Each of these emotional vulnerabilities can be activated by people who want to control your choices and actions. The defense system involves developing emotional immunity, where you can experience these emotional states without letting them control your behavior. This doesn't mean suppressing emotions or becoming cold and unfeeling. It means maintaining your decision-making authority regardless of what emotions you're experiencing. You can feel the fear of rejection and still advocate for yourself. You can feel guilt about disappointing someone and still maintain appropriate boundaries. You can feel anger at disrespectful treatment and still respond strategically rather than reactively. This emotional immunity makes you essentially immune to emotional manipulation because your choices aren't controlled by your feelings. Advanced practitioners of emotional immunity describe it as watching other people's manipulation attempts with detached curiosity rather than reactive engagement. They can see exactly what emotional buttons someone is trying to push, but those buttons no longer have the power to override their judgment. You've been taught that emotions are unpredictable forces that happen to you, but that's the biggest lie in personal development. Emotions follow precise laws of cause and effect, just like any other natural phenomenon. Once you understand these laws, you can predict, control, and direct your emotional states with scientific accuracy. The problem is that most people never learn the operating principles of their own emotional system, so they remain at the mercy of random triggers and unconscious patterns. Understanding emotional causation begins with recognizing that emotions are always preceded by specific thought patterns, physiological changes, and environmental cues. There are no random emotional reactions. Every feeling state has identifiable triggers that can be mapped, understood, and eventually controlled. The first law of emotional causation is that your interpretation of events determines your emotional response more than the events themselves. Two people can experience identical situations and have completely different emotional reactions based on how they interpret what's happening. One person interprets criticism as helpful feedback and feels motivated to improve. Another person interprets the same criticism as personal attack and feels angry and defensive. The difference isn't in the external situation. The difference is in the meaning they assign to the situation. The second law of emotional causation is that your emotional state influences your interpretation of events more than the actual content of those events. When you're in a positive emotional state, you tend to interpret ambiguous situations optimistically. When you're in a negative emotional state, you tend to interpret the same situations pessimistically. This creates emotional feedback loops where your current state shapes your interpretations, which reinforce your current state, which shapes your future interpretations in the same direction. Breaking these loops requires conscious intervention at the interpretation level. The third law of emotional causation is that your physiological state directly influences your emotional experience. Your breathing pattern, posture, facial expression, and muscle tension are constantly sending signals to your brain about what emotions you should be feeling. When you change your physiology, you automatically change your emotional state, because your brain interprets physical cues as emotional information. This is why actors can generate authentic emotional states by adopting the physical postures and breathing patterns associated with different emotions. The practical application of these laws involves systematic emotional engineering, where you deliberately design the thoughts, interpretations, and physiological states that will generate the emotions you want to experience. Instead of hoping to feel confident, motivated, or calm, you learn exactly which mental and physical actions create these states reliably. This transforms emotional regulation from wishful thinking to systematic methodology. The mastery level involves emotional state stacking, where you can layer multiple positive emotional states simultaneously to create compound effects. You might combine confidence-generating physiology with gratitude-focused thinking and curiosity-based questioning to create a powerful state of resourceful optimism that you can access on command. Here's the truth about people who seem naturally calm and composed. They're not genetically different from you. They've simply developed more sophisticated emotional regulation systems through either deliberate training or life circumstances that force them to learn these skills for survival. The calm, unflappable person you admire has probably faced situations that would overwhelm most people, and they developed their emotional strength through necessity rather than natural talent. This is good news because it means emotional mastery is learnable, regardless of your current starting point or natural temperament. The systematic development of unshakable composure begins with understanding that calmness isn't the absence of emotional intensity. It's the ability to experience intense emotions while maintaining behavioral control and decision-making clarity. Truly calm people feel fear, anger, sadness, and excitement just as intensely as anyone else. The difference is that these emotions don't disrupt their ability to think clearly and act effectively. They've learned to function optimally, regardless of their internal emotional weather. The training process involves 3 progressive phases that build on each other systematically. Phase 1 is emotional recognition training, where you develop precise awareness of your emotional states as they arise. Most people only notice their emotions after they've already acted on them, which makes conscious choice impossible. Emotional recognition training teaches you to catch emotional shifts early in their development cycle when you still have maximum choice about how to respond. This involves developing internal early warning systems that alert you to emotional changes before they become overwhelming. Phase 2 is emotional endurance training, where you practice maintaining your optimal functioning while experiencing increasingly intense emotional states. This isn't about suppressing emotions or fighting against them. It's about learning to continue performing at your best while emotions move through your system. You practice having difficult conversations while feeling anxious, making important decisions while feeling uncertain, and maintaining your composure while feeling angry or hurt. The goal is proving to yourself that emotions don't have to control your behavior regardless of how intense they become. Phase 3 is emotional mastery training, where you learn to use emotions as sources of power and information rather than sources of disruption. At this level, fear becomes heightened alertness that improves your performance. Anger becomes focused energy that helps you address problems more decisively. Sadness becomes deepened empathy that enhances your connection with others. Every emotional state becomes a resource that enhances your effectiveness rather than undermining it. The people who complete this training describe achieving a state of dynamic equilibrium where they remain centered and effective regardless of external circumstances or internal sensations. They stop seeing emotions as problems to be solved and start seeing them as energy to be channeled toward their goals and values. Most people think that emotional pain is something to be avoided at all costs, but this attitude actually guarantees more suffering because it makes you fragile and unprepared for the inevitable challenges that life presents. Emotional pain is like physical pain. It's information about what's happening in your system, and trying to eliminate it completely makes you weaker rather than stronger. The key is learning to process emotional pain skillfully rather than avoiding it completely or getting overwhelmed by it when it arises. Professional athletes understand this principle perfectly when it comes to physical discomfort. They know that avoiding all physical discomfort would leave them weak and unprepared for competition. Instead, they learn to function effectively while experiencing significant physical stress. They develop the ability to distinguish between pain that signals genuine damage and pain that simply signals effort or challenge. This same discrimination is essential for emotional development. Some emotional pain signals that you need to make changes in your life or relationships. Other emotional pain is simply the natural result of caring about things that matter to you. Learning to distinguish between these different types of emotional pain allows you to respond appropriately rather than reactively. The pain that signals needed changes includes persistent feelings of resentment, chronic anxiety, ongoing depression, and recurring patterns of emotional upset that interfere with your functioning. These emotions are telling you that something in your life needs attention. Perhaps you're in relationships that don't serve you, pursuing goals that don't align with your values, or living in ways that conflict with your authentic self. This type of emotional pain is a guidance system directing you toward necessary changes. The pain that signals normal human experience includes grief over losses, disappointment about setbacks, fear about uncertain outcomes, and sadness about things you care about that aren't going well. This type of emotional pain doesn't necessarily mean anything needs to change. It means you're having normal human reactions to challenging circumstances. Learning to experience this pain without being overwhelmed by it or taking it as evidence that something is wrong develops emotional resilience and maturity. The processing protocol involves emotional pain tolerance training, where you gradually build your capacity to experience difficult emotions without losing your center or abandoning your values. This involves deliberately staying present with uncomfortable feelings instead of immediately trying to escape them through distraction, numbing, or reactive behavior. You practice feeling sad without becoming depressed, feeling disappointed without becoming bitter, feeling afraid without becoming paralyzed. The goal isn't to enjoy emotional pain, but to prove to yourself that you can handle it without falling apart or making self-destructive choices. Advanced emotional pain processing involves learning to extract value from difficult experiences by asking, "What is this teaching me? And how can this make me stronger?" instead of, "How can I make this stop?" This transforms emotional challenges from pure suffering into growth opportunities. The final frontier of emotional mastery isn't learning to control your emotions better. It's learning to use emotional states as sophisticated tools for achieving your goals and creating the life you want. At this level, emotions stop being things that happen to you and become resources that you deploy strategically based on what each situation requires. This is similar to how a master craftsperson doesn't just have one tool. They have an entire toolkit and know exactly which tool to use for each specific job. Emotional mastery involves developing a complete emotional toolkit where you can access confidence when you need to take risks, compassion when you need to connect with others, intensity when you need to push through obstacles, calmness when you need to make clear decisions, and playfulness when you need to be creative or build rapport. Each emotional state becomes a resource that you can access deliberately when the situation calls for it. The strategic deployment of emotions begins with outcome-based emotional planning. where you identify what you want to accomplish in different situations and then determine which emotional states would best serve those outcomes. If you're going into a negotiation, you might choose to cultivate confident assertiveness combined with curious flexibility. If you're comforting someone who's going through a difficult time, you might choose to access deep compassion combined with stable strength. If you're tackling a challenging creative project, you might choose to combine focused determination with playful experimentation. The key is making these emotional choices consciously, based on strategic considerations, rather than just reacting automatically based on whatever you happen to be feeling. Advanced emotional deployment involves emotional range expansion, where you systematically develop your capacity to access emotional states that don't come naturally to you. Many people have limited emotional range because they've learned to suppress certain emotions, or because they've become habitually stuck in familiar emotional patterns. If you're naturally serious and intense, you might need to develop your capacity for lightness and playfulness. If you're naturally accommodating and gentle, you might need to develop your capacity for appropriate assertiveness and boundaries. If you're naturally optimistic and positive, you might need to develop your capacity for realistic assessment and protective caution. The goal isn't to become a different person. The goal is to develop access to the full spectrum of human emotional experience so you can respond to any situation with the most appropriate and effective emotional expression. The mastery level involves what advanced practitioners call emotional aikido, where you learn to blend with and redirect the emotional energy of challenging situations rather than fighting against it. When someone is angry at you, instead of becoming defensive or counterattacking, you learn to acknowledge their anger while maintaining your own center and gradually guiding the interaction toward a more constructive emotional tone. When you're facing a scary challenge, instead of trying to eliminate the fear, you learn to use the heightened alertness and energy that fear provides to perform at a higher level. This level of emotional sophistication allows you to handle any interpersonal or professional situation with grace and effectiveness because you're working with emotional energy rather than against it. What if I told you that the most successful people in the world have a secret that they never talk about publicly? They've learned to weaponize their emotional states to achieve outcomes that seem impossible to everyone else. While most people are trying to manage their emotions to avoid discomfort, elite performers are deliberately cultivating specific emotional states to enhance their performance, influence others, and accelerate their progress toward their goals. This isn't manipulation or emotional suppression. This is emotional engineering at the highest level. The difference between amateur and professional emotional management is that amateurs try to eliminate negative emotions, while professionals learn to transform any emotional state into useful energy. When a professional athlete feels fear before a competition, they don't try to get rid of the fear. They channel that fear into heightened focus and explosive energy. When a successful entrepreneur feels uncertainty about a business decision, they don't wait for certainty. They use the uncertainty to stay alert for new information and remain flexible in their approach. When a skilled negotiator feels pressure during high-stakes discussions, they transform that pressure into confident assertiveness that actually improves their results. This level of emotional alchemy requires understanding that all emotional states contain energy that can be directed toward productive purposes. The key is learning to separate the sensation of the emotion from the meaning you assign to it. Fear is just heightened alertness. Anger is just focused intensity. Sadness is just deep sensitivity. Anxiety is just anticipatory energy. When you stop labeling these sensations as problems and start seeing them as raw energy, you can begin using them as fuel for whatever you want to accomplish. The training process involves emotional state harvesting, where you practice extracting useful energy from traditionally challenging emotions. Instead of trying to calm down when you feel angry, you practice channeling that intensity into decisive action on problems that need to be addressed. Instead of trying to eliminate anxiety before important events, you practice converting that anticipatory energy into meticulous preparation and sharp focus. Instead of avoiding situations that make you feel nervous, you practice using nervous energy to enhance your performance and presence. This approach transforms every emotional experience into a training opportunity rather than something to be endured or avoided. Advanced practitioners report that they actually begin to appreciate challenging emotional states because they've learned to extract so much value from them. They describe intense emotions as high-octane fuel that can power extraordinary performance if channeled properly. The mastery level involves emotional energy multiplication, where you learn to amplify positive emotional states and compound their effects over time. You discover how to use gratitude to generate more appreciation, confidence to create more opportunities, and enthusiasm to inspire others and accelerate your progress. This creates upward spirals where positive emotional states generate positive results, which reinforce positive emotional states, which generate even better results. You know that feeling when you're in a room full of people and you can sense the exact emotional atmosphere without anyone saying a word? That's not mystical intuition. That's your nervous system picking up on micro-expressions, body language, vocal tonality, and energy patterns that most people process unconsciously. What you're experiencing is emotional contagion, which is the automatic and unconscious mimicry of other people's emotional states. This phenomenon means that the people around you are constantly influencing your emotional state, and you're constantly influencing theirs, whether you realize it or not. Most people are completely unconscious of this dynamic, which makes them vulnerable to emotional contamination from negative, anxious, or toxic people. They walk into a room feeling confident and walk out feeling drained without understanding what happened. They start their day in a positive mood and end it feeling stressed and overwhelmed after spending time around emotionally reactive people. They think their emotional states are determined by their own thoughts and circumstances when they're actually being influenced by the emotional atmosphere of their environment. Understanding emotional contagion is crucial for maintaining your optimal state because it allows you to protect yourself from negative emotional influences while amplifying positive ones. The protection protocol involves developing what psychologists call emotional sovereignty, which is the ability to maintain your chosen emotional state regardless of the emotional atmosphere around you. This doesn't mean becoming cold or disconnected from others. It means becoming so centered in your own emotional state that you're not pulled off course by other people's emotional chaos. Emotional sovereignty develops through conscious state management, where you take deliberate control of your emotional state before entering challenging social or professional situations. You decide ahead of time how you want to feel and what energy you want to project, and then you maintain that state regardless of what emotional influences you encounter. This requires practicing your state management techniques in progressively more challenging social environments until maintaining your center becomes automatic. The amplification aspect involves learning to use emotional contagion strategically by projecting the emotional states you want others to experience. When you enter a meeting feeling genuinely confident and enthusiastic, other people automatically begin to feel more confident and enthusiastic because of emotional contagion. When you remain calm and composed during crisis situations, your emotional state helps others feel more stable and capable of dealing with the challenges. This makes you a positive force in any environment because people feel better when they're around you. Advanced practitioners learn to read and influence the emotional atmosphere of entire groups by understanding how emotional states spread through social systems. They become emotionally magnetic, attracting positive people and opportunities while repelling negative influences naturally. Here's what most people don't understand about emotional intelligence. It's not about being nice, empathetic, or good at reading other people's feelings. True emotional intelligence is about understanding the emotional dynamics that control human behavior and learning to navigate those dynamics strategically to achieve your goals while maintaining genuine care for others. This includes knowing when to be assertive and when to be accommodating, when to be serious and when to be playful, when to challenge people and when to support them, when to create emotional distance and when to create emotional connection. Most people mistake emotional reactivity for emotional authenticity, but these are completely different things. Emotional reactivity means allowing your emotions to control your behavior without conscious choice. Emotional authenticity means choosing emotional expressions that genuinely represent your values and intentions rather than just reflecting whatever you happen to be feeling in the moment. You can be authentically assertive without being reactively aggressive. You can be authentically compassionate without being reactively accommodating. You can be authentically disappointed without being reactively bitter. The difference is conscious choice based on your values rather than automatic reaction based on your impulses. Advanced emotional intelligence involves emotional calibration, which is the ability to adjust your emotional expression based on what each situation and relationship requires. This means being able to access appropriate levels of intensity for different contexts. You might express gentle concern when comforting a friend, firm decisiveness when leading a team, playful curiosity when exploring new ideas, and focused determination when pursuing important goals. Each of these expressions represents authentic aspects of your personality, but the skill is knowing which aspect to emphasize in each situation for maximum effectiveness. The development process requires studying successful people who demonstrate sophisticated emotional intelligence in your field or areas of interest. Notice how they adjust their emotional expression based on the context while maintaining their core identity and values. Pay attention to how they handle conflict, how they build rapport, how they motivate others, and how they maintain their composure under pressure. This observational learning accelerates your development by giving you models of sophisticated emotional behavior that you can practice and adapt to your own style. The integration phase involves practicing emotional range in low-stakes situations until you can access different emotional expressions naturally and authentically. This might mean practicing being more assertive in casual conversations before using that skill in important professional situations. It might mean practicing being more playful and spontaneous with friends before bringing that energy to creative projects. The goal is expanding your emotional repertoire so that you have access to whatever emotional qualities each situation requires while remaining true to your authentic self. Most people think that mental strength means never showing vulnerability or weakness, but this misunderstanding keeps them trapped in exhausting performances that prevent genuine connection and authentic success. True mental strength includes the courage to be vulnerable when appropriate, the wisdom to ask for help when needed, and the confidence to admit mistakes and limitations without losing your sense of worth. This integrated approach to strength creates more sustainable performance and deeper relationships than the brittle toughness that most people mistake for genuine resilience. The confusion comes from conflating mental strength with emotional suppression or invulnerability. Real mental strength isn't about never feeling scared, sad, or uncertain. It's about feeling these things fully while maintaining your ability to take effective action. It's about being honest about your limitations while refusing to let those limitations define your potential. It's about acknowledging your mistakes while learning from them instead of being crushed by them. This authentic strength is actually more powerful than defensive toughness because it's based on genuine self-acceptance rather than fear of being seen as weak. The development of integrated mental strength begins with understanding the difference between strategic vulnerability and destructive oversharing. Strategic vulnerability means sharing your struggles, uncertainties, or limitations when doing so serves a constructive purpose like building trust, seeking genuine help, or encouraging others who face similar challenges. Destructive oversharing means using emotional disclosure as a way to avoid responsibility, manipulate others into caretaking you, or seek validation for victim identity. The key is sharing your challenges from a position of strength rather than helplessness. You acknowledge difficulties while maintaining your commitment to finding solutions and growing from the experience. The practical application involves developing what psychologists call vulnerable strength, where you can be open about your imperfections while maintaining confidence in your ability to handle whatever challenges arise. This means saying things like, "I don't know the answer to this, but I'll figure it out," instead of, "I don't know anything." It means saying, "This is challenging for me, and I'm committed to improving," instead of, "I can't do this." It means saying, "I made a mistake, and here's what I learned from it," instead of, "I always mess everything up." Each of these responses acknowledges reality while maintaining forward momentum and personal agency. The mastery level involves using vulnerability as a tool for building deeper connections and more effective leadership. When you can be appropriately open about your challenges and growth areas, you give other people permission to be authentic as well. This creates environments of genuine trust and mutual support that enable everyone to perform at higher levels because energy isn't being wasted on defensive posturing and image management. You've been told that you need to find balance in your life, but this advice is keeping you mediocre because it assumes that all areas of your life deserve equal attention and energy. The most successful people in the world don't achieve balance. They achieve strategic imbalance, where they deliberately overinvest in their highest leverage activities while maintaining minimum viable standards in everything else. This approach requires sophisticated emotional management because it means accepting that some areas of your life will always feel incomplete or underdeveloped while you focus your energy on what matters most. The balance myth creates emotional guilt and stress because it sets up impossible standards where you're supposed to excel at everything simultaneously. You're supposed to be an amazing parent, exceptional at your career, maintain perfect health, nurture a romantic relationship, stay connected with friends, pursue personal hobbies, contribute to your community, and maintain a beautiful home all at the same time. This creates chronic feelings of inadequacy because there aren't enough hours in the day to excel at everything. So you end up feeling like you're failing everywhere instead of winning in the areas that matter most. Strategic imbalance requires identifying your core priorities based on your values, goals, and life stage, and then deliberately allocating your emotional and physical energy to maximize results in those priority areas. This means accepting that other areas will be adequate rather than exceptional during periods when you're building something important. An entrepreneur launching a business might accept that their social life and hobbies will be minimal for a year while they establish their company. A parent with young children might accept that their personal fitness and career advancement will be secondary priorities for a few years. A student pursuing an advanced degree might accept that their romantic relationship and entertainment activities will receive limited attention while they complete their education. The key is making these trade-offs consciously and temporarily, rather than trying to do everything perfectly and achieving nothing exceptionally. The emotional skills required for strategic imbalance include guilt immunity, where you can pursue your priorities without feeling guilty about areas you're temporarily neglecting. This involves understanding that seasons of focused effort are necessary for achieving meaningful results, and that balance is a long-term goal rather than a daily requirement. You might have perfect balance over the course of a decade, but each individual year might involve significant imbalance as you focus on different priorities. The practical implementation requires regular priority auditing, where you assess whether your current energy allocation matches your stated values and goals. Most people discover significant disconnects between what they say matters most and where they actually spend their time and emotional energy. What if I told you that the reason you can't stick to your goals isn't because you lack willpower or motivation, but because you haven't trained your emotional system to sustain effort through the inevitable periods of difficulty, boredom, and doubt that every worthwhile goal requires? Most people approach goal achievement as if it's purely a logical process of planning and execution, but every significant accomplishment requires navigating complex emotional challenges that can derail your progress if you're not prepared for them. The emotional cycle of goal pursuit follows a predictable pattern that most people don't understand, which is why they abandon their goals during the most crucial phases of the process. The cycle begins with inspiration and excitement when you first commit to a challenging goal. This honeymoon phase feels effortless because your emotions are aligned with your intentions. Everything seems possible, and you feel motivated to take action consistently. However, this phase typically lasts only a few weeks before it gives way to the reality phase, where you encounter the first serious obstacles, setbacks, and evidence that achieving your goal will require more effort and time than you initially anticipated. Most people interpret these challenges as signs that their goal is unrealistic or that they're not capable of achieving it, but these difficulties are actually normal parts of the process that indicate you're making real progress. The reality phase is followed by the commitment phase, where your motivation decreases significantly and continuing toward your goal requires discipline rather than inspiration. This is where most people quit because they expect to feel motivated all the time, and when the motivation disappears, they assume something is wrong. The truth is that motivation is designed to get you started, not to sustain you through the entire journey. Discipline is what carries you through the middle phase, where progress feels slow and results aren't visible yet. The commitment phase eventually leads to the breakthrough phase, where your accumulated effort reaches a tipping point and you begin seeing dramatic results that reignite your motivation and carry you to goal completion. Understanding this cycle allows you to prepare emotionally for each phase, instead of being surprised and discouraged by the natural ups and downs of challenging pursuits. The preparation involves developing emotional endurance specifically for goal pursuit, which means building your capacity to continue taking action when you don't feel like it, when progress seems slow, when obstacles arise, and when doubt creeps in. This requires practicing what psychologists call implementation intentions, where you decide ahead of time how you'll respond to specific emotional challenges that might derail your progress. You plan exactly what you'll do when motivation disappears, when you feel like quitting, when you face setbacks, and when other people discourage you. Having these predetermined responses eliminates the need to make difficult decisions in moments when your emotional state might compromise your judgment. Here's the secret that elite performers know about emotional momentum that ordinary people never discover. Your emotional state in one area of your life automatically influences your emotional state in every other area, which means that winning in any domain creates psychological momentum that makes winning in other domains easier. This is why successful people often seem to succeed at everything they attempt, while struggling people seem to struggle with everything they try. It's not because successful people have more talent or better circumstances. It's because they understand how to create positive emotional momentum that compounds across different areas of their lives. The momentum principle works because your nervous system doesn't distinguish between different types of achievement when it comes to building confidence and emotional resilience. When you succeed at a fitness goal, your brain interprets that as evidence that you're the type of person who can set goals and achieve them, which increases your confidence in professional and relationship contexts. When you master a new skill, your nervous system builds general competence patterns that transfer to other learning situations. When you handle a difficult conversation successfully, you develop emotional capabilities that serve you in all future challenging interactions. Most people unknowingly work against this principle by compartmentalizing their lives and treating each area as completely separate. They think that professional success has nothing to do with personal health, that relationship skills have nothing to do with financial success, or that emotional regulation abilities have nothing to do with creative projects. This compartmentalization prevents them from leveraging success in one area to accelerate progress in other areas. Strategic momentum building involves deliberately seeking wins in areas where you can achieve them most easily and then using the emotional confidence from those wins to tackle more challenging areas. If you're naturally good at learning new skills, you might start by mastering something small that interests you to build confidence before attempting a major career change. If you're naturally disciplined about health, you might use your fitness success as evidence that you can achieve consistency in other areas like financial planning or relationship building. The key is recognizing that all personal development is interconnected and that success in any area builds general life competence. The implementation requires momentum mapping, where you identify which areas of your life currently generate positive emotional energy and which areas drain your energy. You then strategically focus more attention on the energy-generating areas while temporarily accepting minimum viable standards in the energy-draining areas. As you build momentum in your strength areas, you gradually expand your focus to include more challenging areas, using the emotional confidence from your wins to fuel progress in more difficult domains. Advanced practitioners learn to create momentum systems where success in one area automatically supports success in other areas through integrated habits and cross-training approaches. Most people think that confidence comes from accumulating evidence of their competence, but this approach creates fragile confidence that collapses whenever they encounter situations where they lack experience or face unexpected challenges. True confidence comes from trusting your ability to learn, adapt, and handle whatever arises, rather than from believing you already know everything you need to know. This adaptive confidence is unshakable because it's based on your learning capacity rather than your current knowledge, on your problem-solving ability rather than your existing skills, and on your resilience rather than your track record. The development of adaptive confidence begins with reframing challenges as learning opportunities rather than tests of your worth or competence. Instead of asking, "Am I good enough to handle this?" you learn to ask, "What can I learn from this situation?" Instead of viewing mistakes as evidence of inadequacy, you view them as valuable data for improving your approach. Instead of avoiding unfamiliar situations where you might look incompetent, you seek them out as chances to expand your capabilities and build evidence of your adaptability. This mindset shift transforms every experience into confidence-building material rather than confidence-threatening situations. The practical training involves deliberately putting yourself in situations where you don't have all the answers and practicing maintaining your composure while figuring things out in real time. This might mean volunteering for projects slightly beyond your current skill level, engaging in conversations with people who know more than you do, or attempting activities where you'll need to learn as you go. The goal isn't to succeed perfectly in these situations. The goal is to prove to yourself that you can handle uncertainty, learn quickly, and adapt effectively when faced with new challenges. Each successful navigation of unknown territory builds evidence that you can handle whatever comes your way, regardless of your starting point. The mastery level involves what psychologists call meta-confidence, which is confidence in your confidence-building process. You become so skilled at learning new things, adapting to changing circumstances, and bouncing back from setbacks that you develop unshakable faith in your ability to handle any challenge that arises. This creates a paradoxical state where you can be simultaneously humble about what you don't know and confident about your ability to figure it out. Advanced practitioners describe this as feeling simultaneously prepared and unprepared for any situation because they're prepared not with specific knowledge, but with general learning and adaptation capabilities that apply to any context. This level of confidence creates tremendous freedom because you stop limiting your goals and decisions to areas where you already have proven competence. You become willing to pursue opportunities that require you to grow into them, rather than only pursuing opportunities that match your current capabilities. You've been conditioned to believe that other people's opinions of you matter more than your own assessment of yourself, but this external validation system is the source of most emotional instability and self-limiting behavior. Every time you change your behavior to gain approval, avoid criticism, or maintain a certain image, you're training yourself to be controlled by other people's judgments rather than your own values and standards. This creates a fragile sense of self that rises and falls based on external feedback, making you emotionally dependent on the reactions of people who may not understand your goals, share your values, or have your best interests in mind. The approval addiction develops gradually through social conditioning that teaches you to prioritize being liked over being authentic, being accepted over being effective, and being comfortable over being true to yourself. This conditioning is so pervasive that most people don't realize how much their decision-making is influenced by imaginary audiences and anticipated judgments from people whose opinions shouldn't matter. You avoid taking risks because someone might think you're foolish. You don't pursue your real interests because someone might think they're weird. You don't express your genuine opinions because someone might disagree or be offended. You don't set boundaries because someone might think you're selfish. Every one of these self-limiting behaviors is based on giving other people's potentially negative judgments more weight than your own values and aspirations. The liberation process begins with approval detox, where you systematically reduce your dependence on external validation by practicing small acts of authentic self-expression that risk disapproval. This might mean expressing opinions that differ from the group consensus, pursuing interests that others don't understand, setting boundaries that some people won't like, or making choices based on your own judgment rather than seeking consensus. The key is starting with low-stakes situations where potential disapproval won't have serious consequences, and gradually building your tolerance for being misunderstood or criticized. As you practice acting authentically regardless of other people's reactions, you discover that most people's negative judgments have no real impact on your life, happiness, or success. The few people whose opinions do matter are usually those who respect authenticity and independence rather than conformity and people-pleasing. Advanced approval independence involves developing what psychologists call internal locus of evaluation, where your sense of self-worth and decision-making criteria come primarily from your own assessment of your character, effort, and progress, rather than from other people's feedback. This doesn't mean becoming arrogant or dismissive of valuable feedback. It means developing the ability to receive input from others while maintaining your own authority over how you interpret and apply that input. You become someone who considers other people's perspectives without being controlled by their opinions. The final transformation that occurs through systematic emotional training isn't just better emotional regulation or increased mental toughness. It's the development of emotional wisdom, which is the ability to use your emotional experiences as a sophisticated navigation system for creating a meaningful and effective life. Emotional wisdom means understanding that every feeling contains valuable information about your relationship to yourself, other people, and your circumstances, and learning to extract that information without being overwhelmed by the emotional intensity. At this level, you stop seeing emotions as problems to be managed and start seeing them as allies in creating the life you want. Fear becomes an early warning system that helps you prepare more thoroughly for challenges. Anger becomes a signal that important boundaries or values are being violated. Sadness becomes an indicator that something you care about needs attention or that loss needs to be grieved and integrated. Joy becomes confirmation that you're aligned with your authentic self and moving in directions that serve your well-being. Frustration becomes motivation to find better strategies or solutions. Each emotional experience becomes a source of guidance rather than a source of suffering. The development of emotional wisdom requires what advanced practitioners call integration work, where you learn to synthesize the insights from your emotional experiences into coherent understanding of who you are, what you value, and how you want to live. This involves regular reflection on the patterns in your emotional reactions, the recurring themes in your challenges and successes, and the deeper truths that emerge when you pay attention to your emotional life with curiosity rather than judgment. You begin to see your emotional history not as a collection of random experiences, but as a developmental process that has been preparing you for increasingly sophisticated levels of effectiveness and fulfillment. The mastery of emotional wisdom creates what psychologists call earned security, where your sense of stability and confidence comes from your proven ability to handle whatever emotional challenges arise, rather than from trying to avoid challenging emotions or control external circumstances. You develop unshakable trust in your capacity to navigate any emotional territory and extract value from any experience, regardless of how difficult or unexpected it might be. This creates a profound sense of freedom, because you stop limiting your life to emotionally comfortable situations and start pursuing meaningful goals and authentic relationships, regardless of the emotional challenges they might involve. People who achieve this level of emotional mastery describe their lives as becoming simultaneously more peaceful and more adventurous, more stable and more dynamic, more grounded and more expansive. They report that emotional challenges no longer feel like obstacles to overcome, but like opportunities to deepen their wisdom and strengthen their character. This transformation represents the ultimate goal of emotional training, not the elimination of difficult emotions, but the development of such sophisticated emotional intelligence that every feeling becomes a resource for creating a life of purpose, connection, and authentic success.